so much. I am so honored to be here. It's great to be in this wonderful space. It's great to be on campus. It's great to see you beautiful, incredibly talented freshmen who are starting your educational experience here at Alabama State University. I want to first just congratulate the university. I want to congratulate the faculty and the staff and the administrators, and most of all, Dr. Boyd, for your leadership, for making sure that this institution remains a vibrant, bright light in this community, in this state, in this nation. We have a wonderful history on this campus. And with your great leadership and the amazing success that you've had already, that leadership will continue. I want to talk primarily to you freshmen, because we need you to do something. You each have unique gifts. And I don't want you to ever let anybody tell you that you don't have a unique gift. You have a unique gift and you have a unique ability to do something. And you can do a lot of different things, but one of the things you can do is that you can change the world. You can create more justice in the world, and I'm absolutely persuaded that you have that ability. And we need you to change the world because there are some things going on in the world that have to be changed. This country is a very different place than it was 50 years ago. In 1972, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons in America. Today, there are 2.3 million people in jails and prisons in America. This country now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have 6 million people on probation or parole. We've done some terrible things to women in this country. The percentage of women going to prison has increased 646% in the last 20 years. Black women are going to prison at a rate 3 times greater than white women. 70 million Americans have criminal arrests, which means that when they try to get a job or try to get a loan, they are disfavored. There is this epidemic of over-incarceration. We're doing terrible things to people when they come out of prisons. In 2015, the president came to Alabama. He came to Selma to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March. The president came, members of Congress came, 80,000 people came, and they gathered at the Edmund Pettus Bridge to march across the bridge, as they do every year, to commemorate that historic march, which celebrates the passage of the Voting Rights Act. But very few of those 80,000 people who came to Alabama last year had any idea that today in Alabama, 30% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote as a result of a criminal conviction. And the statistic that keeps me up late at night, the real reason why I'm persuaded you have to help create a new world, is one from the Bureau of Justice. The Bureau of Justice now predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. 1 in 3. That was not true in the 20th century. It was not true in the 19th century. It has become true in the 21st century, and we need to change the world. We need to create more justice. Many of you are facing risks of arrest and wrongful conviction and imprisonment that are dramatically higher than the people who sat in this space just 20 years ago. And so we have to do some things, I am persuaded, if we want to change the world. And I want to just talk about 4 of them. The first is that I think if you want to change the world, if you want to create more justice, if you want your unique gift to resonate in ways that makes a difference in the lives of people, the first thing I'm persuaded you have to do is that you've got to get proximate to the places and the people who are suffering from abuse and neglect. You've got to get proximate to the parts of this community and the community that you come from where there's suffering and violence and neglect. Many of you have been taught that if there's a part of town where there's a lot of poverty, if there's a part of town where there's a lot of abuse and neglect or addiction or disorder, you should stay as far away from that part of town as possible. I'm going to ask you today to do the opposite. I think if you want to change the world, you've got to actually go to the parts of town where the schools aren't functioning very well. You've got to go to the parts of town where people are struggling with addiction and despair. You've got to get closer to people who are in jails and prisons. You've got to be there for people coming out of jails and prisons. I am persuaded that we've got to get proximate to the places and the people where there's abuse and suffering. You cannot problem solve. You can't change the world from a distance. I've learned this. That if you want to problem solve, you've got to get close enough to the problem to understand the problem. You've got to understand the nuances and details of that problem. We've got too many people trying to problem solve from a distance. They won't get close to the problem, and their solutions aren't working because they're not proximate. And I know it sounds a little bit scary, but I also want to tell you that there's power in proximity. When you get close to the problems you care most deeply about, when you get close to people who have been oppressed and abused and neglected, you will find power. I'm the product of someone's choice to get proximate. I grew up in a community where black children couldn't go to the public schools. I had to start my education in a colored school. In my county, they wouldn't let black kids go to the public school. There were no high schools for black kids. When my dad was a teenager, he couldn't go to high school. And then lawyers came into our community in the 1960s and made them open up the public schools. And because of their choice to get proximate to poor black kids like me, I got to go to high school. I got to go to college. And I have no illusions about the fact that those people hadn't got proximate to me, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you today. But because they did, I got to go to high school. I got to go to college. I got to college, I remember sitting exactly where you are when I was a college freshman. College for me was like a completely different world than the world I'd come from. I grew up in a poor rural community. It was very agrarian. I'd never seen some of the things I saw on that college campus. And I was very active in music and I was very active in sports. And I'll be honest, when I got to college, I thought I was in this magical place. I loved college. If you went to the cafeteria, they would feed you. If you didn't go to class, nobody would beat you up. It was safe. There were all these wonderful things happening. And after my second year in college, I woke up one morning and I just said, I love college. And then I thought about it and I said, you know what? I'm going to spend the rest of my life in college. And I called my mother. I said, Mom, I've decided, I've made a decision. I'm going to spend the rest of my life in college. And my mom said, well, I didn't go to college, but I don't think they're going to let you do that. I said, well, Mom, they'll let me do that. And I was a philosophy major in college. And because I was a philosophy major, I thought I was supposed to go out on the hillside and think these deep thoughts. And so I would go out on the hillside, and one day during my senior year, I was thinking what I thought were these deep thoughts, and somebody came up to me and said, you know, you're a senior, and you're a philosophy major. What are you going to do when you graduate from college? I heard this as a very hostile question because I realized that nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated from college. And because nobody in my family had graduated from college, I didn't know what I'm sure all of you already know. I didn't know that in this country, if you want to do graduate work, if you want to stay in school and get into graduate school, and you want to study history or English or political science, to get admitted to graduate school, you actually have to know something about history, English, or political science. I was pretty intimidated by that, so I kept looking, and so to be honest, that's how I ended up in law school. It was very clear to me, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. You don't. And I ended up at Harvard Law School a few months later, and I was deeply disillusioned. Because they weren't talking about racial inequality, they weren't talking about poverty, they weren't talking about suffering. And I found it deeply alienating. And I finished my first year at the law school, and I went over to the School of Government. I decided to get a degree in public policy. And when I got to the School of Government, I found myself alienated there too. I'd been there a couple of months, and I woke up one morning and I looked in the mirror and I thought, wow, I'm even more miserable here than I was at the law school. And I went back to the law school, and I was about to do something I'm going to urge all of you to never do. I was about to make a choice to pursue a career as a lawyer that I knew was not going to fulfill me, that I knew was not going to excite me, that I knew was not where my heart was. And there will be times during your time in college, there will be times in your life where there will be pressures for you to do the things that you don't really want to do, to pursue the things that are not really your passion and your heart. And I'm going to urge you, don't do it. It was about that time that I got proximate. I actually went to death row in Georgia, and I met condemned prisoners for the first time. And I went down to death row. The lawyers had asked me to go down there and meet somebody who was not, who they had not had a chance to meet. And they said, please, just go meet this man and explain to him that he's not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And I drove down to death row. I was so nervous, so worried. And I got down to death row, and when I opened the door to the prison, it was dark and intimidating. They took me back to the visitation room, and I was waiting there nervously for this condemned prisoner. And after 10 or 15 minutes, they opened the door, and there stood the first condemned prisoner I'd ever seen. And the thing I remember about him is that he was weighed down with chains. He had handcuffs on his wrist, he had a chain around his waist, he had shackles on his ankles. It took them 10 minutes to unchain this man. And finally, they had him unchained. He walked inside, and I went up to him and I said, I'm so sorry, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a law student. I don't know anything about the death penalty. I don't know anything about criminal law. I don't know anything about civil law, but they've sent me down here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And as soon as I said that, the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that's when this man grabbed my hands and he said, thank you, thank you, thank you. He said, you are the first person I've met who's not a death row prisoner or a death row lawyer in the 2 years that I've been on death row. He said, now because of you, I'm going to see my wife and I'm going to see my kids. I've been talking to my wife and my kids on the phone, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid they'd show up and I'd have an execution date and I didn't want them to have to deal with that. He said, now because of you, I'm going to see my wife and kids. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I couldn't believe how even in my ignorance, being proximate could have an impact on the quality of someone's life, but it clearly did. We started talking, this man and me, and it turned out we were exactly the same age. We had the same birthday, same month, same day, same year. He started asking me questions about my life. I asked him questions about his life, and we fell into this conversation. 45 minutes turned into an hour turned into 2 hours, 2 hours turned into 3 hours, and we were still talking. I'd only scheduled to be there an hour, and the guards were getting outside were getting frustrated and angry that I was in there so long. And finally, after 3 hours, they couldn't bear it any longer, and so these guards got up. And they came bursting into the room, and they couldn't do anything to me, so they took it out on this man. They threw him against the wall. And they started putting the handcuffs on his wrist so tight you could see him grimacing in pain. They wrapped the chain around his waist. I begged them to be gentler, but they ignored me. Then they took the shackles and put them on his ankles, and they were treating him so roughly. I said, please, please, it's not his fault, it's my fault. And the man looked at me and said, Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back. And then they started shoving this man toward the door. They almost knocked him down. And I was watching in horror as they were pushing this man roughly out of that visitation room, and they got him by the door, and then I watched this man do something. When they got him by the door, he planted his feet. And the next time when they shoved him, he didn't move. And then I watched this man turn around, and he said to me, he said, Bryan, don't worry about this, you just come back. And then this man closed his eyes, he threw his head back, and he did something I've never forgotten. He started to sing. And he started singing this hymn I used to hear all the time. He started singing, I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Everybody stopped. The guards recovered and started pushing him down the hallway. And you could hear the chains clanging as he was being pushed down the hallway, but you could hear him singing about higher ground. And I will tell you, hearing that man sing changed me. All of a sudden, I knew I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. But more than that, I knew that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey. I realized that if he doesn't get there, I can't get there. And in a moment, my interest in the law was radicalized because I got proximate to the condemned. I went back to Harvard Law School. You couldn't get me out of the law school library. I needed to know everything about substantive due process, procedural due process, and finality and comedy. And it was in proximity that I discovered my passion, your calling, your choice, your power is waiting for you, not just in the classrooms, not just on this campus, but in poor communities, in neglected communities, with people who are suffering from abuse and oppression, in jails and prisons. And if you choose to get proximate, you'll find your power and you'll begin to change the world. But proximity is not enough by itself. The second thing I'm persuaded you have to do, if you want to change the world, is you've got to change the narratives that have sustained inequality and injustice. You see, there are narratives out there about your worth, about your value, about Alabama State, about people of color. There are narratives out there that are part of the problem when it comes to creating justice. And we have to change the narratives. You see, mass incarceration wasn't created just by policy decisions. We decided to treat drug addiction and drug abuse as a crime. We could have said that that's a health problem. But we used the narrative of crime and criminality. We didn't do that for alcoholism, by the way. People who are alcoholic have a disease. And if we know somebody who's an alcoholic and we see them going into a bar, we don't think, let's call the police. That's a health problem. But with drug addiction and drug dependency, we said those people are criminals. And because of that choice, we've sent hundreds of thousands of people to jails or prisons. But the reason why we made that choice is because of a narrative. And that narrative is a narrative rooted in what I call the politics of fear and anger. Our politicians have been preaching fear and anger for 50 years. And they've used that narrative of fear and anger to justify a war on drugs, to justify these harsh policies. The police that are shooting young people down on the streets feel like they are warriors and soldiers in a war created by this narrative of fear and anger. And we've got to change the narrative. They've done some terrible things to children. In this country, there are 250,000 children in jails and prisons. In the 1980s, there were people going around this country arguing that there are some children who aren't children. They said that there are some kids out there that they may look like kids, they may act like kids, they may sound like kids, but don't be deceived, they said. These aren't children. They said these are, quote, super predators. That's a word they made up to demonize a generation of children, mostly black and brown kids. And every state in the country lowered the minimum age for trying children as adults. We put thousands of kids in adult jails and prisons. We began to do this construction. We constructed a pipeline. We call it the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline. The challenges that you're going to face on this campus were disrupted because funding that used to go to schools and education was taken away and invested in jails and prisons. And it was this narrative that was the cause of it, and we have to change the narrative. I worked on a case some years ago involving a 14-year-old boy who lived in a household where his mother was repeatedly the target of a lot of domestic violence. This boy's mother had a boyfriend. And when this man would start drinking, he'd get violent. And one day the man had been drinking, and he came home and he called the boy's mother into the kitchen. He walked into the kitchen, he walked up to this boy's mother, and he just punched her in the face. She fell down and she hit her head as she fell. She was on the floor bleeding and unconscious. Her son came running in to help his mother. He tried to stop the bleeding. He tried to get her to wake up, but she wouldn't respond. And after 10 minutes, this child thought his mom was dead. She wasn't dead, but he thought she was dead. So this little boy got up and he walked into the bedroom where the man was sleeping. And he went over to a dresser drawer where he knew this man kept a handgun. And he opened up the dresser drawer and he pulled out the gun and he walked over to where this man was sleeping and he pointed the gun at the man's head. The man was snoring, and when the man stopped snoring, this little boy panicked. And he pulled the trigger and shot the man in the head. The man died almost instantly. This little boy was very small for his age. He was under 5 feet tall. He weighed less than 100 pounds. He'd never been in trouble before. He had a good record in school, and he might have been tried as a juvenile, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, well, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. The judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they immediately placed him in the adult jail. He'd been there 3 days before his grandmother called me to get me involved. And I went to the jail to see this little boy, and I was just astonished by how terrified he looked when he walked into the visitation room. And I sat down and I started asking him questions, but no matter what I asked him, he wouldn't say anything. He just sat there. I put my pen down and said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me. The little boy wouldn't say anything. I got up and I walked around the table. I pulled my chair close to him. I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. He wouldn't say anything. Couldn't figure out what to do. I just sat there. And after a few minutes, I leaned on him. I don't even know why, but I leaned on him. And when I leaned on him, he leaned back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him and I said, come on, you've got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And that's when this little boy started to cry. And through his tears, he began talking to me, not about what happened with his mom, not about what happened with the man, but he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night several men had hurt him. He told me on the next night he'd been raped by several people. He told me on the night before I'd gotten there, so many people had hurt him, he couldn't remember how many there had been. And I held this little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. I finally got him calm. I said, look, I'm going to get you out of here. You stay right here. And I never will forget trying to leave that jail and that little boy grabbing me by the arm saying, please, please, please don't go. Please don't go. I said, no, it's okay. It's all right. I'm going to be right back. You stay right here. And I left that jail. And the question I had in my mind when I left the jail was, who is responsible for this? And the answer is, we are. We are. We've allowed a narrative to emerge in this country that some children aren't children. We are throwing away children, black and brown children, in high-risk neighborhoods, in poor neighborhoods, in juvenile facilities. We're throwing them away, and we have to change that narrative. I need you to take your gift and give it to the traumatized children in Montgomery. Give it to the kids who have been abused and neglected. Give it to the kids in your communities and in your families and in your spaces that are looking for something hopeful, looking for something transformative. All children are children. And when we change that narrative, we can begin to deconstruct this pipeline. We've got to change narratives. We've got to change the narrative about race in America. You see, you're at this beautiful campus, but you are also in a genocide state. You are in a slave state. You're in a lynching state. You're in a segregation state. You're in a death penalty state. And there is this history of racial inequality that is all around us. You're breathing smog created by our history of racial inequality. And we cannot get free. You cannot change the world until we start doing something about this narrative of racial difference that still burdens all of us. And we've got to talk about the genocide. The Trail of Tears passes through Alabama. We did something horrific to Native people. Before white settlers came to this continent, there were millions of Native people, indigenous people, and they were killed by the millions. It was a genocide. But we don't like using that word. And because we don't like using that word, we haven't done the things you're supposed to do if you're a post-genocide society. We just instead said, no, they're a different race, and so it doesn't matter. And we use that narrative to then tolerate decades of slavery. And the great evil of American slavery for me wasn't involuntary servitude, it wasn't forced labor. The great evil of American slavery was the narrative of racial difference that we created to legitimate slavery, because we are still struggling against that narrative. The great evil of American slavery wasn't the bondage, wasn't just the change, it was the ideology of white supremacy that we made up in this country to legitimate slavery. We said black people are different than white people, and that narrative continues. If you read the 13th Amendment, it only talks about involuntary servitude and forced labor. It doesn't talk about narratives of racial difference. And for that reason, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades of terrorism and lynching. And that legacy of slavery is all around you. If you go downtown to Commerce Street and you walk down to the river, you need to know that at that riverside, down in Montgomery, there were ships that came here between 1840 and 1865 bringing tens of thousands of enslaved people. The rail station was the place where tens of thousands of enslaved people were brought to this city. They'd be chained together, and then they'd be paraded up Commerce Street, where the alley is, right there. If you come to our building, you're going to know that our building was a slave warehouse. They would house these enslaved people in warehouses and depots all over town, and then they would take them to that circle up the street at Commerce and Dexter, and they would sell them as part of the slave auction site. And we've got all kinds of markers in this city about the Confederacy. We've got all kinds of markers about the legends of the Confederacy, but we don't have very many markers about that slave trade, and we've got to change that narrative. That era of lynching and terror. We've got to give voice to it. You see, because something tragic happened between Reconstruction and World War II. Lynching was terrorism. And older people of color understand it. They come up to me sometimes and say, Mr. Steveson, I get angry when I hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our history after 9/11. They say, we grew up with terrorism. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced throughout that period. And that history is part of what we have to challenge. And even for you students who are here from Cleveland, or Chicago, or Detroit, or New York, or Los Angeles, or Oakland, or other parts of this country, you need to understand that the demographic geography of this nation, the reason why you're in those communities, has everything to do with our history of racial terrorism. You see, the black people that went to Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland didn't go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went to those communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. And we haven't talked about that. And that legacy continues. And then we get into the era of segregation. And we talk a lot about civil rights, and it's wonderful. And we got so many civil rights icons in this community. We need to understand their stories. We need to understand the power of what Rosa Parks did, what Dr. King did, what all of the legendary figures, Vernon Johns, all of these folks. But I worry sometimes when I hear people talking about civil rights, because I'm afraid that we've gotten too celebratory when we talk about civil rights history. I now hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and it's starting to sound like a 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on a bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. On day 3, we changed all the laws and racism was over. And it would be great if that's our history, but that's not our history. Our history is that in this state, in this country, for decades, we said to black people, you can't vote just because you're black. We said to black people, you can't go to school because you're black. My parents were humiliated every day of their lives. When they'd see those signs that said white and colored, they weren't directions, they were assaults. And we haven't tried to treat and manage and care for those assaults, and they've created scars that still hurt, and so we've got to change the narrative. And now we're living in this era of mass incarceration and excessive punishment, and the hardest thing I have to say to you this afternoon is that there is now, because of this narrative of racial difference, a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that follows black and brown people in America. And if you're black and brown, you are burdened with this presumption of dangerousness and guilt, and it doesn't matter how good your grades are, it doesn't matter how hard you study, it doesn't matter how well you do at this institution, you will be places where you're going to be presumed dangerous and guilty. And I can tell you, as somebody who's been fighting this, I'm 56 years old, and I will tell you that it's exhausting, constantly living with a presumption of dangerousness and guilt. It starts to wear on you. And we've got to change the narrative. If we want to create more justice, we've got to understand the threat posed by this narrative, so we have to change it. We needed truth and reconciliation in this country in the 1960s, and we passed it by. So we've got to reclaim it. If you go to South Africa, you can't spend time there without being confronted with the history of apartheid. If you go to Rwanda, they will not let you spend time in that country without learning about the genocide. If you go to Germany, you'll see markers and stones at the homes of all the Jewish families that were abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans actually want you to go to the camps and reflect soberly on the legacy of the Holocaust. In this country, we don't like talking about slavery. We don't like talking about lynching. We don't like talking about segregation. We don't like talking about presumptions of dangerousness and guilt. But we've got to start talking. We've got to change this narrative, because on the other side of this narrative is something that feels more like freedom. And we cannot get there until we change the narrative. We have changed the narrative. There's wrong. We have a consciousness about domestic violence that we didn't have 40 years ago. We don't tolerate it the way it used to be tolerated. We have a consciousness about the climate that we didn't have 40 years ago. And you need to be the architects of a conversation that changes the way we think and talk about this presumption of dangerousness and guilt. And we can do it, but we've got to change the narrative. We're putting up markers all through downtown Montgomery about the slave trade. We're about to open a museum next spring that's going to talk about from enslavement to mass incarceration. Not far from here, we've bought 6 acres of land. We're going to build the first national memorial to victims of lynching. We want you to be partners with us as we create these spaces to change the narrative. But the third thing you have to do, we can't change the world with just changing the narrative and bringing policy. The third thing I'm persuaded you have to do is that you've got to stay hopeful. And I hope it doesn't sound too preachy for me to say this to you, but I really do believe your hope is essential to your capacity to do well at this institution, but more than that, to do well in changing the world. I'm persuaded that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. I believe injustice prevails where hopelessness persists, and you've got to be hopeful about what you can do if you want to change the world. And there will be times in your classroom, on this campus, during your studies, where you get hopeless about your ability to be the person you want to be. It will happen. And you've got to fight against that hopelessness. You've got to protect yourself from that hopelessness, because it is essential that you stay hopeful. Hope is what will get you to stand up when other people say sit down. Hope is what will get you to speak when other people say be quiet. And you've got to figure out what are the things that threaten your hope dynamic, and you've got to fight back against it. I'll tell you, I live here in Montgomery, Alabama. And in a lot of ways, Montgomery is the last place I should be. Because what challenges my hope dynamic, I'll just share it with you. I'll be honest, I don't like it when people start talking about the good old days of the 40s and 50s. I don't like that. I don't like it when people try to romanticize the past. I don't like that in this state, Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday. I don't like that Jefferson Davis's birthday is a state holiday. I don't like that we don't have Martin Luther King Day, we have Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day. I don't like that the 2 largest high schools in the city are Robert E. Lee High and Jefferson Davis High. I don't like that the landscape is littered with the Confederate flag and these emblems of resistance to integration. I don't like that we don't want to talk about these important issues, but I've got to stay hopeful enough that we can take it down, that we can change this narrative, and your hope is going to be key to your ability to do the same thing. I'm persuaded of that. But fourth and finally, I don't think you can change the world with just your hope, just changing the narrative, just being popular. The fourth thing I think you've got to be willing to do, and this is a hard one, is that the fourth thing I think you have to be willing to do is you've got to be willing to do uncomfortable things if you want to change the world. And I wish I didn't have to say that, because we're human. And humans like comfort. We do. We like comfort. And I'm not against comfort. But I think if you want to change the world, you're going to sometimes have to leave the comfortable spaces of this campus. You're going to have to leave the comfort of your friends. You're going to have to leave the comfortable places where you come to grow and nurture, and you're going to have to go someplace uncomfortable and be a witness. You're going to have to do uncomfortable things if you want to change things. I've studied, I've researched, I've tried to find examples of oppression ending, injustice being overcome, where people didn't have to do anything inconvenient or uncomfortable. I can't find any examples of that. It only happens when we do the uncomfortable, and doing the uncomfortable is hard, I get it. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying don't be comfortable. I like comfort. I'm not against comfort. You know, I gave a talk down in Mississippi. People met me at the airport. They said, "Oh, Mr. Steveson, we know all about you. We read your book. We know what kind of lawyer you are. We know what kind of person you are. And we have to tell you that we're having our conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. And we decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. We've asked one of the farmers to put you up at the barn." I said, "What is wrong with you?" I said, "Of course I want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel." That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is sometimes you do have to position yourself in difficult places. The president mentioned some of the successes that we've had representing people on death row. It's been wonderful to free people who've been wrongly convicted. There's a man who spent 30 years on Alabama's death row who was released last year. His name is Anthony Ray Hinton. You should invite him to campus sometime. You really should. He's got a powerful story to tell. He was locked in a 5x7 cell on death row here for a crime he did not commit. During his early years, he would complain about smelling the flesh burning when they would electrocute people in the electric chair. We came up with evidence of his innocence. We presented it to the state. They refused to do a simple test that could prove his innocence for 16 years. We won his release last summer, and every day I talk to him, it's like this fresh shower. I feel something exciting, knowing that he's now at his house planting his tomatoes, gardening in his garden, knowing that he took his first trip to the state of Hawaii last week. It's all very exciting, but I will tell you that not every case ends that way. I've also had some difficult moments. Several years ago, we had a bunch of executions in this state. Between 2009 and 2011, 17 executions in the 30-month time period. Every other month somebody was being executed. We don't have a public defender system in this state. There is no statewide system. Poor people don't get the legal help they need. We have a legal system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, is shaping outcomes. And these condemned prisoners were facing execution without counsel, and our lawyers were getting involved. And I watched my young lawyers get beat down by these cases, and I said, "You know what, I'll take the next case. You all take a break." And I got involved in a case of a man who was facing execution in 30 days, and this man suffered from intellectual disability. He had mental retardation. And I went to the court and said, "You can't execute this person. The Supreme Court has actually banned the execution of people with intellectual disability." I said, "You can't execute him." And the court said, "Too late. It should have been raised earlier." I said, "It's not too late. He's still alive. We can stop this." They said, "No, too late." And I went to the state court, and the court said, "Too late." And the appeals court said too late, and the federal court said too late. One of the challenges in our legal system is that our legal system seems to be more committed to finality than fairness. And on the day of this execution, I was waiting to hear from the Supreme Court, and I was pacing in my office about an hour before the scheduled execution, and finally the phone rang. And there was the clerk of court telling me that our motion for a stay of execution had been considered and reviewed by the court, and the court had decided to deny the state the motion for a stay. Too late. I picked up the phone to call this man and give him this heartbreaking news, and I told him I cannot stop this execution, and that's when this man began to cry. And then he began to sob. And through his tears, he said, "Mr. Steveson, I've got something really important I have to say to you. Please don't hang up." And then this man tried to say something to me, but he couldn't get his words out. In addition to being intellectually disabled, he had another challenge. When he would get upset, when he would get anxious, when he would get worried, he'd begin to stutter, he'd begin to struggle. He had a speech impediment, and all of a sudden this man couldn't get out a single word. He kept trying to say something, he kept trying to say something, he kept trying to form a word, but he couldn't get out a single word. And I was holding the phone, listening to this man struggle, using his last minutes on this earth just to say something. And the harder he tried to talk, the more he was just ripping my heart apart. And I stood there, and the next thing I knew, there were tears running down my face. And he kept trying, and he kept trying, and he kept trying. And I could hear the guards trying to rush him, which just made it worse. And all of a sudden my mind wandered. I remembered when I was about 9 or 10, and I went to church one Sunday. My mom took me to church, and I was talking to my friends, and I remembered how we met this little boy, a little skinny kid. And he wasn't saying anything. And I remember looking at that kid and asking him a question, "Where are you from? What's your name?" And I remembered how when I asked that little boy that question, he couldn't get his words out either. He also began to stutter. And because I was 9 or 10 and I didn't know any better, I did something really ignorant. I laughed. And my mom saw me laughing at this child, and she gave me a look I'd never seen before. And she came over and grabbed me by the arm, and she pulled me aside, and she said, "Bryan, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that." I said, "I'm sorry, Mom, I didn't know." She said, "No, you know better than that." And then my mother said, "You go back over there and tell that little boy you're sorry." I said, "Okay, Mom." And I took a step, and she grabbed me by the arm. She said, "Wait, after you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy." I sort of rolled my eyes and I said, okay, Mom. And I took a step and then she grabbed me by the arm again. She said, wait, after you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him. I said, Mom, I can't go over there and tell that little boy I love him. And she gave me that look again, so I said, okay. And on the night of this execution, I remember going over to this little boy and walking up to him and saying, look, man, I'm sorry. And then I remembered sort of lunging at him and giving him my little boy version of a man hug. And then I remember trying to say to this child as insincerely as I possibly could, I said, look, man, I love you. And what I'd forgotten was how that little boy hugged me back. And then I remembered how he whispered flawlessly in my ear, he said, I love you too. I was thinking about that while this man was trying to get his words out. And then the man finally got his words out. He said, Mr. Steveson, I want to thank you for representing me. And then he said, I want to thank you for fighting for me. And the last thing that man said was, Mr. Steveson, I love you for trying to save my life. He hung up the phone. They pulled him away. They strapped him to a gurney, and they executed him. I hung the phone, and I said, I can't do this anymore. It's too hard, too uncomfortable, too painful, too hard. I kept thinking about how broken he was. And the question I had in my mind is, why do we want to kill all the broken people? What is it about us that when we see brokenness, we want to crush it, we want to humiliate it, we want to throw it away, we want to kill it? And then I realized that all of my clients are broken people. I represent the broken. My clients have been broken by poverty, they've been broken by racism, they've been broken by disability, they've been broken by addiction, broken by neglect, broken by despair. I represent the broken, and then I realized I work in a broken system. The people with power are unwilling to get proximate. They're locked into narratives of fear and anger. They are not hopeful, and they will not do uncomfortable things. And I said, you know what, I don't have anything more to do with this. And I sat down and I had that conversation you have when you're about to make a big important decision. I started thinking, well, you better think about why you've been doing what you're doing. And all of a sudden, I realized something. I realized something I'd never realized before. I all of a sudden realized why I do what I do. And what I realized is that I don't do what I do because I'm a lawyer. I don't do what I do because it's about justice. I don't do what I do because I've been trained to do it. I don't do what I do because if I don't do it, no one will. I don't do what I do because it's important. When I realized that night, in that moment, is that I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth is that if you get proximate, if you change narratives, if you stay hopeful, and if you do uncomfortable things, it will break you. But I want to tell you there's power in brokenness. It is the broken that have shown us how to get to compassion. It's the broken that can teach us the way justice is supposed to work. It's the broken that can lead us to mercy. You don't have to be unbroken to be excelling at this university. It is not your wholeness, but sometimes your brokenness, your capacity to feel and connect with those who are suffering that changes things. I believe really simple things. I believe that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if someone takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer. And we cannot do justice until we know the other things about you. I am also persuaded that in this state, in this community, in this country, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I think we talk too much about money in America. I am persuaded that in this country, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we do justice, we deconstruct the conditions that give rise to poverty. And finally, I believe that we have to judge how we're doing here in Alabama State. You're going to have to judge how you're doing as a student, as a professional, as a graduate, not by looking at how you treat the people who are rich and the powerful and the privileged. I don't want you to judge how you're doing by how you are measured and applauded by people with power and wealth. We can't judge how we're doing in this country by looking at how we treat the rich and the powerful. We've got to look at how we treat the poor and the incarcerated and the condemned. It's in that nexus that we tell who we really are. And I want to say this to you, and I'm going to sit down. You have this gift. You have this opportunity. You have this ability to change the world. I just want you to commit to get proximate. Change these narratives. Stay hopeful and do some uncomfortable things, and you will see the world change. I want to say one more thing. I want you to do well at this university. I want you to do extremely well. But I don't want any of you to think that your grades are a measure of your capacity to change the world. They are not. When you leave here, I want you to have good jobs. I want you to succeed in life. I want you to have a good, comfortable income. But I don't want any of you to think that your income is a measure of your capacity to change the world, because it is not. I'll end with this. There's a different metric for those of you who really want to change things, who want this justice quotient to increase. It was taught to me by an older man. I was giving a talk in a church, and this older man came into the back of the church in a wheelchair, older black man. And he was staring at me the whole time I was talking with this stern, almost angry look on his face. And he kept looking at me so hard, I couldn't figure out what was going on. And people were there, and they were very nice. I finished my talk, they came up, they were very appropriate, but that older black man was still sitting in the back just staring at me with this stern, angry look on his face. And finally, when everybody else left, this older black man got a young kid to wheel him to the front of the church, down the center aisle of that church. And when he got up in front of me, he put his hand up and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I just stood there. And he asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I mumbled something, I don't even remember what I said. Then he asked me one more time, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And then this older black man looked at me, he said, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And this older man looked at me and he said, "You're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice." And I was so moved. I was also really relieved because I just didn't know what was going to happen. And then this man did something. He grabbed me by the jacket, he pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, "Come here, I'm going to show you something." And this old man turned his head. He said, "You see this scar I have down here behind my right ear?" He said, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, 1963, trying to register people to vote." And then he turned his head, he said, "You see this cut down here on the bottom of my neck?" He said, "I got that cut in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964, trying to register people to vote." Then this man turned his head, he said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise, got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, trying to register people to vote." And then this older man looked at me, he said, "Come here, young man, I'm going to tell you a secret." He said, "People look at me, they think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." I know some of you in this place, some of you in this place have already been cut and bruised and scarred, but I don't want you to think that they don't mean anything. They are the things that actually get us closer to honoring what it means to create justice. I'm excited because there are hundreds of you on this campus, in this city, in this community. We want you to come and visit us at EJI. We want you to come and volunteer with us. We want you to come and work with us, but mostly we want you to get proximate. I want you to change these narratives. I want you to stay hopeful, and I want you to do uncomfortable things to create justice. And when you do it, we will change the world. I wish you all the best to you in your work and studies. Thank you very much.